did the cardio-metabolic test on the treadmill. We did the hydrostatic weighing in the dunk tank. It's a great experience, very unique. Now we're gonna see what it all means and how we can put it all together.
Perfect. All right, so what we want to do first is just kind of go over how you did.
Okay.
So I have little benchmarks that we're looking at related to specifically the CardioMet profile. And we'll bring in the body comp as it relates to your overall fitness here, that we're, as far as the general markers for where you're at right now in your fitness and health.
Okay.
So first, we want to get on the same page for terminology. If we were going to just have one score from that CardioMet profile to say how fit is Brett for endurance type activity,
okay,
I would look at your VO2 at the anaerobic threshold. So remember, the anaerobic threshold is, if you're looking on this graph, it's where we typically go down to 100% or down in fat, 100% carbohydrates. So we're getting into those real specific high dependency on anaerobic type fuel burning.
And that's where the lactate starts to build up in your muscles?
Right, it's always being generated, but now it starts accumulating.
Okay.
And so we have a problem with acidosis and other fatigue products. The energy systems that are being used, the more anaerobic energy systems, are creating more of that.
And that's the level at which you can only work for a short period of time.
Yeah, technically at the anaerobic threshold right here, AT, that's our number. AT VO2 is the amount of oxygen you're burning here. But at that level, you could go an hour if you had a pit bull behind you chasing you. Okay. I mean, it's an all-out effort for an hour.
Yeah.
So obviously, the higher you are above the anaerobic threshold, that shorter time that you can sustain it.
Okay.
So it's really not as high an effort as you think, but if you tried to sustain it, it would be really grueling.
Got it.
And you'd have to slow down eventually.
Okay.
Obviously, any of these you'd have to slow down eventually. It's just how eventual.
Right.
But this is where we really see significant difference.
Okay.
So we use it as a benchmark because if you can train appropriately, if you're a non-exerciser and you start exercising, we see your aerobic capacity, which is how high did we go on the VO2 at the end, and your threshold are both going to move up significantly. But if you're already exercising regularly as you are, it's going to be hard to move that.
Okay.
But there are ways that we can work on it.
So that's a good point. So for a beginner starting out getting these tests, it's a real good benchmark to say, how am I progressing, and continue to measure it.
Right.
When you've been doing it for a while, it's a lot harder to move the needle, a lot harder to continue to progress on that.
Exactly. As you're getting fitter endurance-wise, you're going to move your threshold closer and closer to your peak. So we have a potential to reach here, usually that, for an elite athlete, we can get up as high as 90%. Okay. This just means you've been doing some intensity in Orange Theory. Yeah. So you're pushed it up into the 80s. If you were in what we would typically call moderate activity or a base period, if you were training for an event, you would be in the 70% range of your true peak if you're able to do that.
So if does that information help you then set your training zones?
That's more of a benchmark.
Okay.
Am I getting the bang for my buck from my training?
Got it.
So just because your aerobic capacity doesn't go up necessarily doesn't mean you're not getting sustainably faster or able to burn a higher amount of calories with less effort. Okay. Which would be all attributed to increasing that threshold. It's kind of a fine line. So there's a red line. If you do too much high intensity training, which can happen if you're doing 3 or 4 or 5 days of anaerobic endurance type training or high intensity interval training, then this will actually sometimes go backwards. Yeah.
I see that in people where they sort of stall in their health goals or their fitness goals.
Kind of a plateau.
Right, because they're not giving their bodies adequate rest, that they're pushing their bodies too hard, too often.
The older we get, the more rest we need. Yeah. So, we could have a young individual, I should say, who wants to exercise and can get away with 3 or 4 days of pretty hard efforts. Right. Not suggesting it, because they can even get fitter if they don't do quite as much. Right. Again, it depends on the total volume of their training and are they able to recover. But for most of us, when we're getting up over 35, 45 years old, we probably can only really get away with about 2 or 3 days a week of high intensity interval training. Okay. And the more training you do throughout the week, the less you're going to be able to get away with doing too much of the anaerobic or the higher anaerobic type work. For an individual who's just trying to maximize ability to lose weight or that type of thing, or may have some type of an event they want to prepare for, it's the same idea. You don't necessarily want to crush it all the time because you're not going to necessarily be able to maintain that type of fitness. So it's kind of an evolving type of a scenario if it's ideal.
Okay.
What would be specific to anybody is if you go out and let's say you have a client who is on a walking program.
Yeah.
So they're basically keeping really consistent but at a moderate level 5 or 7 days a week. So they're trying. That's really good as far as activity-wise. They're going to get health benefits from it, but they may hit that plateau where they're really not going up in their ability to burn calories.
Right.
So they become also really efficient. So in other words, the walker gets better and better at their stride. They're doing it a lot. And so they can end up getting faster and using less energy. So to some extent, that's one of the reasons, for example, in Orange Theory, you're mixing it up, you're doing different things. You don't want to get too efficient at it, so you can keep clicking into a higher level of calorie burn.
That's a good point. The more comfortable you get and the more efficient you get in your activity, the less calories you're burning with that activity.
And you could still be doing the work, but you're just not getting the same calories.
That's why it's so important for a balanced training program to have some moderate cardio, to have some resistance training and some high intensity interval training interspersed with rest. So you're mixing it up and keeping that
and even the type of activity, cycling to walking to rowing, mixing it up sometimes will help you from hitting that plateau when you don't need to. So we have one more marker here on the metabolic side is the VO2 at this fat bump. So remember, you're going to use, to some extent, you're going to hit a point during that test as we go up in workload where you're at your highest ability to use fat for fuel. And then it'll start to trend downward.
Okay.
So what happens is if you have a good utilization level at a fairly good workload, that means you can do a lot of work and recover quickly. You're not blowing through your carbohydrates too quickly. So for the average individual, having a good fat utilization capability is another form of fitness. In other words, you're going to do more of your moderate work and recover really quickly from it. That's going to help you get fitter.
And this is a hot topic because people like to be in that fat burning zone. They want to know that they're burning their fat. So how would someone's diet or nutrition affect these zones that you see? Yeah,
so very good question. So if you're eating a lot of simple carbohydrates, sugars especially, you don't get a good balance to your fat utilization. You don't eat enough of the good fats. And obviously have enough protein in your diet. You can throw this down a little bit. So more carbohydrates means burn more carbohydrates. So we know this from athletes or individuals who are training for long events because if they're really taking in too much carbohydrates all the time and they're doing activities that you need to sustain for a long period of time, what happens is we see a click in and they start to need more carbohydrates. So we are now training athletes so that we can get them better fat adapted. And so we don't feed them as much carbohydrates. Carbohydrates are really important for a race. You need to get them in to fuel your potential. But if you're doing moderate work sustained, you don't need a whole lot if you're in a good fat bump.
So for the average person trying to get healthier, trying to move more, exercise more, if they're eating too many carbohydrates, too many simple carbohydrates and sugars, they could be sabotaging their
fat bump.
Their fat bump.
Their ability to use fat. And really the benefit of having that is you're just going to cope that much better with your training.
Okay.
So because you can recover better, you're not always on the up and down swing on your sugar level in the blood. So anytime you can use fat better for energy, you're going to be feeling better and potentially at a higher performance level.
So now take it to the extreme, someone who follows the ketogenic diet, ketogenic lifestyle, very high fat consumption, very low carbohydrate. How does that change the curve?
Well, I've seen some who, especially ultra distance athletes who get into the ketogenic process or diet, I've seen some amazing fat utilization levels where they're really pretty much 100% or close to their fat contribution at a fairly high workload.
Okay.
So there are some big adaptations that could be profoundly impactful for somebody who wants to sustain energy for a long period of time.
And the point isn't to say you should be eating ketogenic or you should be following a ketogenic lifestyle. The point is to say that this is sensitive to your nutrition, to your fat, carbohydrate, protein, macronutrients. And so we have to pay attention to that, not just from a nutrition standpoint, but from an exercise standpoint as well.
Yes, exactly. Well said.
So let's talk about the afterburn theory. So if you are in your high intensity zone for more than 10 or 12 minutes, that's when you're supposedly trigger this afterburn. Is that right?
Yeah, the longer you can stay near or above that anaerobic threshold, the higher EPOC you're going to have.
Okay. And how much of a percentage does that impact your calories burned from your workout?
Oh, that's a good question. I've heard, I think, 20% more.
Okay.
But even potentially more than that. Okay. Here's the thing that's another reason to get fitter. If you're looking at a really fit individual on the endurance side, they're going to be able to tolerate a higher level of fatigue, another higher level of workload at their threshold. So their EPOCs are going to be exponentially higher. So some people who are just starting out or not very fit because of their workouts or just genetics, they have a hard time getting up to that level of fitness, they're not going to get the same production on EPOC. So even though they're working their rear off, their production is not the same as if somebody who's at a higher level of fitness. But that's another reason to try and push these numbers up a little bit.
So the afterburn, or the EPOC, is the calories that your body's burning after you finish the exercise. So you're not even exercising anymore, but because of the work your body did, you're continually burning those calories. And what we're talking about is the fitter you are, the longer you can spend at that zone where you trigger the afterburn or the EPOC to give you an even greater bump after you're done exercising. When you're not quite as fit, you're not going to be able to spend as much time in that zone, so your afterburn is going to be less. So that's even more incentive to get that fitness up, keep up the training, so you get the benefit of the afterburn much more efficiently. So when you have information like this with the body fat percentage, if I wanted to drop a few more percentage, what kind of advice can you put together by this package to say, here's what I think you need to change?
As far as weight loss goes, you mean?
As far as body fat loss.
Well, it's always where you're starting from. So again, as I mentioned earlier, exercise can only do so much for weight loss, so 60 to 70% of that success is going to be the diet. So the first thing is to look at the diet, see if we can clean it up and optimize, which obviously you're an expert on as well, optimize what you're doing in the feeding side and make something available to you that's palatable and you can do for a long period of time. And I never try and give anybody any short-term fix here. In other words, your body fat, you may not be where you need to be or where you want to be, but the first priority is to focus on the process.
I think that's such an important point, that it's not try this one thing and you're going to fix it, and it's not just focus on your exercise and we're going to get you down there. It's all integrates together with the nutrition, the exercise, and it's the process, it's the lifestyle to get you to the point you're trying to get.
Yeah, so process before product. So we do want to get the body fat down, but we need to change the lifestyle first. We need to make it very agreeable to the individual, but at the same time have an impact. So we usually, just as we talk about the athlete model, I'll usually, if they haven't been doing enough exercise or consistency to it, we'll just develop a base to their exercise program. So we want to get consistency first at a low level of intensity so it's very tolerable. It's not going to add up to a lot as far as burning body fat. We may get some weight loss, but it's not going to get you to the goal typically. But if you can increase progressively, so you get a platform set, then we start adding some of these high intensity intervals in appropriately over time for a couple of days a week. You try and max, if weight loss is concerned, you try and max the number of days that you're doing activity. So we're doing 6 or 7 workouts a week and then trying to increase the senseless activity that you do throughout the day. That all adds up to augment the diet so that you can get a little bit more comfortable diet in place and still get success from it.
Very good.
That's usually how I put it. But you need to be able to be aware of where you're at, what kind of intensity is appropriate, and then how to progress through that. So that's where the zones come in.
Now the next part that we can look at from this information is getting the actual training zones down. So when we're doing our high intensity interval training, we know where our target heart rates are to get us into the orange zone, the red zone, and then back us off into the recovery zone. So what did we learn here about that?
All right, so your particular heart rate at that anaerobic threshold, right there, was 150. So just by the research, we kind of come up with percentages of that. So typically, for example, in Orange Theory, they're taking a predicted max heart rate and they're taking percentages to quantify what level you're at. So now we know from the anaerobic threshold that this is zone 4. This is where we are at that anaerobic threshold where fatigue is really accumulating at a higher rate. But technically you could go, if you had a pit bull, for an hour right there, right? So, so we take percentages to determine where zone 3 is, just kind of a cutoff. That's what we call a tempo range. It's kind of the in-between. Right. So now we're starting to get into high intensity, zone 4 and above. It's all considered high intensity interval.
So when we're doing our intervals, we want to make sure we get into that zone 4, we get into the anaerobic threshold, probably hold it from anywhere from 30 seconds to 3 minutes, and then back off into the zone 3.
Yes, that's the concept.
Right. So we've also been talking about heart rate in terms of the minimum you want to get past for the high intensity, but on the flip side, on the days where you're doing your moderate cardio and not doing your high intensity, that's the level you want to stay below.
That's where we put a lid on it. Yeah. And that's where a heart rate monitor comes into the most handy for you. You're still, like Orange Theory classes, you do because you have a certain protocol you're trying to stick to, so you need the heart rate to make sure you're doing it right. But for most cases, to depend on a heart rate zone, it's going to be those lower levels that you're using it at.
Right, so you use it to stay below your ceiling, and then for the higher intensity, you know when you're in it, and from there it's more a perceived effort.
Right.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense.
And then you were talking about how long it takes to recover. So if I was dealing with somebody who's trying to get faster, and that's why they're doing their high intensity intervals, it's all about the recovery in between because they need to go just as fast each interval.
Right.
If you're doing more of a metabolic conditioning, which is kind of fit for Orange Theory, where you're just trying to maximize the workload for the workout and still cope with it, then you're going to have less and less recovery, even though you're pushing hard up at those levels. But you're going to, even though you feel like you're working just as hard, you're going down in your work capacity as you go. Here, when you're doing zone 6 and 7 and even zone 5 intervals, we're taking 1.5 to 2 to 5 times the amount of time that you're actually pushing the load to recover so you can go back and do the same load again. So 2 different concepts with high intensity interval training.
Now, one of the other things we see a lot of is people go to the gym, they're on the treadmill, and the treadmill will tell you how many calories you burn for that half an hour you were on.
Right.
They use some sort of a crazy formula to do that, and it's going to be so different from person to person that it's highly inaccurate. So a test like this, though, this gives us a more accurate reading of how much calories we burn at a certain workload.
Yeah. Let me give you an example. So if we go back and look at your test scores, remember when we were talking about efficiency? So you're using 42.8 milliliters. The predicted value, based on the workload, which is usually how we come up with a calorie expenditure prediction, we base it off the workload and your heart rate level. Well, that's going to be 46.
Okay.
So technically, you're burning less calories, right? At that same workload. You know, if you're using a certain heart rate monitor that actually is determining calorie expenditure, I would have my client go out and do a zone 2 type workout, or they'll go and do their intervals and see what the cumulative amount of calories is according to the monitor or whatever device you're using. And then you can double check it with here. If we're seeing 200 or 300 calorie difference, then you're over expecting how much you're burning.
And that's so important for those people who do like to keep track of their calories in and calories out. It's the same concept. If you're working with bad data, you're going to get bad results. So this type of test is so important for someone who really likes those hard measurements to know that they're running a calorie deficit or equal calories.
And to some extent, everybody should know the hard numbers, but they don't need to track them daily. Because if you're typically eating and you don't realize it 300 or 400 or 500 calories more than you're expending, how do you expect to lose weight, right? Even if you're eating a real clean diet and doing everything correctly. So you have to know you're in the ballpark, right?
Right. And calorie counting on a daily basis is not something I recommend for everybody because it can be very stressful. It can be very time consuming.
And who can do it?
And who can do it, right? But to get a feel for it, or for those who do like to do it, some people are very data driven, this is crucial. Okay. I'd like to thank Ken Nicodemus from Fit Stop Lab for joining us today. That was a really interesting day. Went through the cardiometabolic testing, did the hydrostatic weighing, and then talked about what it means for us in designing a fitness program, what the zones mean, our fat bump, the afterburn, and how we can incorporate all this into our training program for designing high intensity interval training, but also knowing when to take the moderate days and not get into that high intensity range. So for anybody who really wants to be objective about this and have the proper data to get started, this type of testing is so important. And then as a metric that you can follow your body fat percentage, which is a much better measurement than just the scale or body mass index. That's something you can follow over time to track your progress, and then also get retested on the cardiometabolic testing to see how your thresholds and your zones change as you improve in your training. So thank you very much. This was a great experience, and I look back to coming back later to learn how I've changed.
Excellent. Yeah, I want to see some numbers.
All right.
Move to the right.
Thank you very much.